Today we're gonna start, if you haven't already, editing your work. So I've just got like some tips, a little guide for just general editing your work, specifically your first draft. Okay, so we kind of already talked about this. If you have feedback from a critique group, first thing you want to do is go through, decide what you want to keep, what you want to throw away, and then once you've like made all of those decisions, you're gonna have to start figuring out how to implement all of those like edits and feedbacks. If it like applies to the larger plot, or if it's just that little section or the scene. Once you have decided that you need to make edits and you've decided what kind of edits to make, it's kind of important that you do them in the correct order, because if you do them out of order right here, there's a good chance that you're just gonna redo something that you already edited before, and so it's like, what was the point of editing it if you're like going over it to edit it later? So always start with the big plot character changes. Did somebody notice a plot hole that you have to fix? Or is somebody like, your character is kind of boring, maybe you should give them more of like a interesting backstory or something. So anything that's going to make changes throughout the whole thing, like in little sections, do that first, because that could change like big chunks of your book. You could like delete whole chapters, or have to rewrite scenes, and then you can kind of get down to the chapter by chapter, scene by scene editing. Do I need to add more descriptions in here, more character details in here, more setting information? Does it need more dialogue or whatever? Do I just need to get rid of this chapter altogether? And then once you've done that, you can get even smaller and just kind of start looking at, how is my writing? Is this dialogue feel right? Does it flow well? Do my sentences make sense? Do I need to start focusing on some grammar? So start big and then just like work down small, because if you start editing, this like one scene, and then you realize later that you're gonna have to cut that scene, it's like, oh, well, you did all that work for nothing, so darn it. Sometimes you're getting feedback chapter by chapter. So sometimes you'll send somebody a book and they'll review the whole book and give you edits for the whole book. And sometimes it's like chapter by chapter, as you're writing, you're sending it to people. That's kind of what I do. And then they give you your feedback. So these are just some tips for if you're going chapter by chapter, how to like make edits as you're going. So definitely make sure you're taking note of any thoughts or feedback that's going to impact the big plot, so you can implement that later. If somebody has a question in your chapter, if they're like, hey, you brought up this thing, does that mean XYZ? Or like, that doesn't really make sense here. And if you can answer it later in your story, if you're like, oh, don't worry, that's coming up, then you're good. But if it's like, oh, I didn't really consider that and we don't really address that at all, you probably want to make a plan to, put that in somewhere to answer that question that people had. Unless it's like, that's not important, you don't need to have that question, move on. So either you can kind of take notes and be like, okay, well, when I rewrite it in draft 2, I'll implement all of this stuff. Or if you feel like it, you can be like, oh, okay, well, I'm writing chapter 3 next week, so I'll start implementing those edits in chapter 3 and then submit that next week, and we'll see how it goes from there. That could potentially be more helpful because you're kind of like editing as you're going. It'll be like a better version of your first draft, but entirely up to you. And then remember, we're talking about early drafts here. So if people give you like typo comments or like, this sentence was said weird, that's not the most important thing to focus on, because there's a chance that you're going to completely rewrite it later. And then I just have some just general tips for editing. Take a break before going back. So like if you write your first chapter, don't like immediately go back and start editing your first chapter. It's good to just kind of take a break, get some space, view it with fresh eyes, sleep on it, kind of thing. Maybe like make a checklist for yourself as you're going through and like editing. So, is there something in my chapter that leads towards the climax? If not, this chapter is useless and you should probably just either get rid of it or make sure there's something in there that's useful and leads the character one step closer to the climax. Is there some new information? Do you have like setting information or plot information or character information? Like every chapter should have at least a few new things in there. And then if there's like unnecessary stuff, like if you're just like including a bunch of garbage stuff that just like we don't need to know, you don't need it in your book. Like, unless it's like legitimately, again, you're writing some epic fantasy that everybody wants to know these crazy details that kind of maybe don't have anything to do with the plot, but it's fun to know. That's your choice as an author. But for the most part, if it's like unnecessary to character or plot or setting, you can just kind of cut that out. And then check for pacing. Does it flow? Do you need to break any, really long stretches of info dumping? Do you need to kind of break it up with maybe some dialogue or some action? Or maybe is it too quick and maybe you need to add a little bit of setting in there to kind of ground the readers better? And then just the last few, check that each character has their own unique voice. You don't want everybody to sound the same, especially if you have like multiple main characters. If you have any places that are really telly, but you could zhuzh it up so we're showing instead of telling. Don't forget sensory details are great. Don't just kind of describe everything. Talk about what they're hearing, smelling. And then this is a little bit more nitpicky, but like if you notice you're using a lot of adverbs, like if it ends with ly, or if you're using like a lot of the same word, maybe try to take note of that. And as you're going, kind of try to think, okay, I'm using that one too much. Get the thesaurus out. What can I use instead? Okay, so those are just general first draft editing tips. Nothing crazy, just some advice.